Magnolia Grove was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect on the outside. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and manicured lawns gave it a postcard-worthy charm. But beneath the surface, behind those flower beds and freshly painted porches, there were rules enforced with an iron fist by the Homeowners Association. And no one was more committed to those rules than Karen Holloway. Karen was the self-appointed guardian of suburban peace, the one who measured grass height with a ruler, who counted the number of trash cans left at the curb, and who believed that even the slightest deviation from HOA regulations was an act of rebellion. So, when my 16-year-old son, Jake, and his friends started practicing in our garage, it was only a matter of time before Karen declared war. It started with a note, taped to our front door, written in perfect cursive on floral stationery. Dear neighbor, the excessive noise levels coming from your garage are disturbing the peace of our community. As per HOA guidelines, please ensure that all sounds remain at an acceptable volume. Thank you for your cooperation. Karen Holloway. I sighed. Jake and his friends, Ethan, Lucas, and Mia, were just kids playing music. They weren't partying, they weren't causing trouble. Just a few guitars, a drum kit, and a dream of one day playing real gigs instead of just rehearsing in our garage. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. That was my first mistake. The second complaint came 2 days later. This time, Karen didn't bother with a note, she came in person. I was pulling weeds from the garden when I saw her marching across my lawn, arms crossed, lips pursed into a thin, judgmental line. Jessica, she greeted me, her voice dripping with false politeness. Karen, I replied, matching her tone. She exhaled sharply. We need to talk about that. She paused, as if the word physically pained her. Music. Asterisk. They're just practicing, I said. It's disruptive, she insisted. I've spoken to several other neighbors, and they all agree. It's simply too much. I doubted that. Our next-door neighbors, the Coopers, hadn't said a word. The retired couple across the street? Hard of hearing. That left exactly one person who was disturbed. Karen leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. As a mother, you should be concerned. Rock music? Drums? This sort of thing leads to undesirable behavior. I nearly laughed. Karen, they're playing classic rock. Not summoning demons. Her nostrils flared. Consider this a friendly warning, she said, before spinning on her heel and storming off. Jake came out of the garage just as she left. Let me guess, he said. Karen? I nodded. Well, he smirked. Good thing we're playing extra loud tomorrow. And they did. Karen lasted 3 days before she snapped. It was a late Saturday afternoon, and the band was mid-rehearsal when it happened. The music was loud, yes, but not ear-splitting. I was sitting in the kitchen, sipping coffee, when I heard the familiar wail of sirens. I rushed outside. A police car had pulled up in front of our house, lights flashing, radio crackling. A stocky sergeant with graying hair stepped out, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. Karen was already there, hands on her hips, looking smug. Officer, she began, thank you for responding so quickly. I have called multiple times about this household's blatant disregard for noise ordinances. These children insist on playing their instruments at illegal volumes, disrupting the entire neighborhood. Jake and his friends had stopped playing, standing near the garage, looking nervous. I approached the officer, forcing a polite smile. Good evening, Sergeant. I wasn't aware we were breaking any laws. The sergeant adjusted his belt and pulled out a decibel meter. We'll see about that. Karen grinned. I watched as he walked up to the garage, where the band had been playing. He checked the device, studied the numbers, then turned to Karen. Ma'am, he said, the sound level is well within legal limits. Karen blinked, then scowled. That can't be right, she snapped. Maybe check it again? The sergeant raised an eyebrow, but humored her. Same result. Legal. Jake and his friends exchanged glances, trying not to laugh. Then, something unexpected happened. The sergeant looked past Karen and addressed the band. What were you kids playing? Lucas hesitated before answering, Led Zeppelin. Immigrant song. The sergeant's face lit up. No kidding, he said. I saw them live back in '77. Damn good band. Karen's jaw dropped. I bit back a grin. You kids mind playing something for me? The sergeant continued. Jake perked up. Really? Yeah, the sergeant nodded. Been a while since I've heard some good classic rock. I turned to Karen, whose face was rapidly turning red. You can't be serious, she sputtered. But it was too late. Ethan counted off, and the garage filled with the opening riff of Sweet Child O' Mine. Karen stood frozen, fuming, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she might implode. The sergeant? He was tapping his foot. When the song ended, the sergeant clapped. Damn, he said. You kids are good. Keep practicing. You ever need a gig, I know some bars looking for weekend bands. Karen looked like she wanted to burst into flames. This is ridiculous, she hissed. I demand you do something. The sergeant sighed and turned to her. Ma'am, the music is within legal limits. There's nothing I can do. If you continue making false noise complaints, you could be fined. Karen's eyes bulged. Fined? I am upholding community standards. No, ma'am, you're wasting police resources. And with that, he tipped his hat toward Jake and the band, got in his car, and drove off. Karen spun toward me, seething. This isn't over. Then she stormed away. Jake turned to me, grinning. So, can we keep playing? I laughed. Absolutely. From that day on, the band played louder than ever. And Karen? Let's just say, she stopped calling the cops. For a few glorious days, peace returned to Magnolia Grove. Jake and his band kept practicing, the music flowed, and no sirens came wailing down the street. But I should have known. Karen Holloway was not the type to let something go. She had lost a battle. But she was about to declare war. It started with an envelope. A thick, official-looking one, stamped with the HOA logo, stuffed into my mailbox. I sighed, already knowing who was behind it before I even opened it. Dear homeowner. This letter serves as a formal warning regarding recent violations of the Magnolia Grove Homeowners Association guidelines. It has come to our attention that your household has engaged in disruptive activities, namely excessive noise production at irregular hours. Under Section 14B of the HOA bylaws, repeated infractions may result in fines or further action. Please remedy this situation immediately to ensure compliance. Respectfully, Magnolia Grove HOA Compliance Board. I glanced down at the bottom. Karen's name was bolded as the compliance officer who had issued the complaint. Of course it was. I folded the letter, set it on the counter, and let out a deep breath. Then, I grabbed my phone. It was time for a meeting with the HOA. The Magnolia Grove HOA meetings were held at the community clubhouse, a fancy name for a soulless, beige room with bad lighting and uncomfortable chairs. When I walked in, Karen was already there, sitting at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her subjects. The other HOA board members, most of whom I barely recognized, sat beside her, flipping through stacks of paperwork. Karen smiled. Too wide. Too satisfied. Jessica, she greeted. I assume you're here regarding the notice? I crossed my arms. I assume you're here because you don't have anything better to do than harass my kid for playing music. Karen's smile vanished. Rules are rules, she snapped. And the board has determined that your home is in violation. One of the other HOA members, an older man named Mr. Dawson, cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, technically, the sound levels are within the county's legal limits, so... Karen glared daggers at him. It's a nuisance, she insisted. And nuisance violations are still enforceable under HOA policy. I sighed. Karen, be honest. Is this about noise, or is this about you? Her face turned an impressive shade of red. This is about maintaining community standards, she snapped. Really? Because it feels a lot like you just don't like the fact that my son's band is having fun. The room went silent. Karen straightened her spine, clearly trying to regain control. Your family is making Magnolia Grove unpleasant for the rest of us. If you do not comply, further action will be taken. And what action would that be? I asked, tilting my head. Karen leaned forward, her eyes glinting. Fines, for starters. Possibly escalating to legal action if the disturbances continue. I exhaled slowly. You're really willing to take this to court over a garage band? If necessary. I stared at her for a long moment. Then, finally, I smiled. All right, Karen, I said. Let's play. Karen had clearly assumed I would back down. What she hadn't counted on was the fact that I had a brother-in-law who was a real estate attorney. I called him that night, explaining the situation in painstaking detail. After a long pause, he finally said, Jessica, you do realize this HOA has no real authority to enforce a noise complaint when the actual county laws say you're fine, right? So she's bluffing? I asked. Oh, she's bluffing so hard it hurts. He laughed. Honestly, if they try to fine you for this, you could probably turn around and file a harassment claim. That got my attention. Harassment? Yep, he confirmed. HOAs have rules, sure, but they can't enforce things that contradict county or state laws. If you challenge this in small claims court, it won't hold up. A slow grin spread across my face. Oh, this is going to be fun. At the next HOA meeting, I came prepared. Karen barely had time to open her mouth before I pulled out a stack of legal documents and slid them onto the table. Karen, I said sweetly, before you threaten me with fines or legal action again, you might want to read these. She frowned, flipping through the pages. Then, as she realized what they were, her face paled. What is this? She stammered. Oh, just an official letter from my attorney stating that your noise complaint has no legal basis under county law, I said. And that if you continue this targeted harassment, I am fully prepared to take legal action against you and the HOA. A satisfying silence filled the room. Even Mr. Dawson looked impressed. Karen sputtered. You wouldn't. Try me, I said, folding my arms. Karen glared. Then, in a move that was so predictable it was almost funny, she stood up and stormed out. Jake and his friends kept playing. Karen, for the first time in her nosy, meddling life, stayed quiet. The HOA quietly dropped the noise complaint. A few weeks later, I saw Sergeant Davis, yes, the same rock-loving cop, at the grocery store. Hey, he said, tell your kid to keep practicing. We need more good bands in this town. I grinned. Oh, don't worry, Sergeant, I said. The music isn't stopping anytime soon. And just like that, the battle was won. Karen? She still watched from her porch, fuming, arms crossed. But she never called the cops again. Because at the end of the day, you can't stop the music. Guitar fire. For a while, things were quiet. Suspiciously quiet. Jake and his band kept playing. Sergeant Davis remained a certified fan, and the HOA? Well, after the legal smackdown I delivered, they backed off. But Karen Holloway? She was waiting. Plotting. Seething. I saw it in the way she watched our house, arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line of pure hatred. She wasn't the type to admit defeat. No, she was the kind of person who spent her entire existence making other people miserable just for the fun of it. And then, one day, she made her next move. It started with small things. The first letter arrived in my mailbox on a Monday morning, typed on plain white paper, no return address. Your lawn is looking unkempt. As per HOA guidelines, all grass must be no longer than 2 inches. I stared at my perfectly fine, freshly mowed lawn. Then came the next letter. Your trash cans were left out too long. HOA rules dictate they must be removed from site within 3 hours of pickup. 3 hours. Who was timing that? Then another. Your holiday decorations are excessive and do not conform to the Magnolia Grove aesthetic. It was a single string of white lights. Jake read the letters over my shoulder. Wow, he muttered. She's lost it. I exhaled. She's testing me. I knew exactly what she wanted, to wear me down, to chip away at me until I either gave up or snapped. But Karen had underestimated one crucial fact. I was petty as hell. After the 5th complaint, I decided to fight fire with fire. I took the stack of letters straight to Sergeant Davis. Harassment, you say? He mused, flipping through them. No proof she wrote them, I admitted. But let's be real, who else would do this? Davis smirked. Karen Holloway is a special kind of pain in the ass. He set the letters down and leaned back in his chair. Tell you what, Jessica. I'll pay her a little visit. Not because we can arrest her for passive-aggressive notes, but because, well, I'd love to see her face when she realizes we're watching. I grinned. Now that's community service. That evening, I was sipping a well-earned glass of wine when I saw Sergeant Davis pull up to Karen's house. She answered the door in record time, clearly thrilled to have the police at her beck and call again until she saw who it was. Davis smiled pleasantly. Karen's own smile vanished. From my porch, I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Karen's face go through all 7 stages of rage. First, confusion. Then, denial. Then, anger. Finally, defeat. Davis tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Karen fuming on her porch. The second he drove off, she turned and glared directly at me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A week later, she sprang her trap. Jake and his band were mid-rehearsal when the cops showed up. Not Sergeant Davis this time. Other officers. Younger. Karen must have figured out she couldn't get Davis on her side, so she'd waited until another squad was on duty. They knocked on my door, polite but firm. Ma'am, we received multiple noise complaints about your property. Karen was hovering in the background, arms crossed, smirking. I smiled sweetly. Oh, of course, officers. I assume you brought a decibel meter to check if we're actually violating any ordinances? The officers blinked. Karen froze. One of them started. We were just... Oh! I interrupted. Sergeant Davis always checks first before issuing a warning. He's great, by the way. Maybe I should call him to clarify? One of the officers rubbed the back of his neck. Karen's smirk was gone. We'll check, the officer muttered. They walked over to the garage. Checked the levels. And, shocker, the sound was within legal limits. One officer sighed. Sorry for the trouble, ma'am. Jake and his friends were trying so hard not to laugh. Karen? She stormed inside without another word. Karen had failed to use the law against me. So she turned to the HOA. I got another letter, this time summoning me to an urgent HOA disciplinary hearing. Translation: Karen was throwing a tantrum. So I went. The meeting was packed more than usual. And to my shock, several neighbors actually stood up for me. Mr. Dawson cleared his throat. Mrs. Holloway, he said, I think we can all agree that this vendetta has gone on long enough. Karen's face twitched. This is about community standards, she snapped. Karen, another neighbor, interrupted. Half of us have grandkids. You don't see us calling the cops over a little music. Another HOA board member nodded. Honestly, I think the band's kinda good. Karen lost it. This is ridiculous. If no one is willing to uphold the rules, then she made her biggest mistake. Then maybe I should resign. A pause. Then Mr. Dawson said, all in favor of accepting Karen's resignation? Hands shot up. Karen turned pale. She had bluffed and lost. Karen stormed out. Jake's band played extra loud that night. A few days later, she put her house up for sale. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee, as the for sale sign went up. Jake wandered outside, stretching. You think she'll actually move? I smirked. She lost. She has no power here anymore. Of course she's moving. Jake grinned. You know what this means? What? He grabbed his guitar. Encore. And just like that, the music played on. Karen was gone. For weeks, Magnolia Grove was peaceful. The sky seemed bluer. The air felt lighter. The world was simply better without her patrolling the sidewalks like an underpaid mall cop. Jake's band practiced freely, and for the first time in months, I didn't wake up wondering what petty nonsense I'd find in my mailbox. Then the moving van arrived. A hulking U-Haul rolled up to Karen's old house on a Saturday morning, filled to the brim with furniture, boxes, and, oddly, several antique bird cages. Jake peered out the window. New neighbors? I nodded. Let's just hope they're not as bad as. The driver's door slammed open. A man stepped out. Late 50s, rigid posture, crisp button-up shirt tucked into khakis. He screamed ex-military. Then the passenger door swung open, and his wife stepped out. She wore a beige cardigan in the middle of summer, a frown already set deep into her face, and a pair of binoculars hanging around her neck like a fashion statement. "Oh no," Jake muttered. I closed my eyes. Oh yes, it didn't take long to learn their names. Harold and Judith Henderson. Retired. Married for 30 years. And, according to every other neighbor I spoke to, they had moved here for one reason and one reason only: to restore order to Magnolia Grove. I heard it straight from Mrs. Cooper, our elderly neighbor. They asked if this was a quiet neighborhood. She told me over the fence. I said, most of the time. Then Judith squinted at your house and said, "We'll see about that." My stomach dropped. Karen may have been bad, but at least she was predictable. The Hendersons? They were an unknown threat. And unknown threats are always worse. 2 days after they moved in, Judith struck. Jake's band had just started warming up when I heard a sharp knock on the door. I opened it to find Judith Henderson standing stiff as a board, holding a clipboard. A clipboard. Not a good sign. "Jessica, is it?" she said. "That's me," I answered, already bracing myself. "I'd like to discuss the noise issue." Straight to the point. "What noise issue?" I asked, leaning against the door frame. "The one coming from your garage." "Oh, you mean my son's band practice?" Her lips thinned. "If that's what you call it." I stared at her. She stared back. A full 10 seconds of silent suburban warfare. Finally, she flipped to the second page of her clipboard. Per Magnolia Grove HOA Regulations, Section 14B, all noise must remain at a reasonable level to maintain community standards. I smiled. "Did Karen give you that clipboard in her will?" Judith's nostrils flared. "This is a serious matter. If your son and his group continue disrupting the peace, I will be forced to file an official complaint." I folded my arms. "Oh, please do. I'd love for Sergeant Davis to come back. He's a fan, you know." Her eye twitched. I won that round. But Judith was just getting started. 2 days later, I got a new HOA notice. Jake took one look at it and groaned. "You've got to be kidding me." It wasn't just from Judith. It was from Harold, too. They had teamed up. "Dear homeowner, due to repeated noise disturbances and failure to comply with community guidelines, this property is now under HOA scrutiny. Continued infractions may result in fines and/or disciplinary action. Sincerely, Judith and Harold Henderson." I laughed out loud. Jake squinted at me. "You okay?" I was ready for Karen. I wasn't ready for the HOA Avengers. That night, I did something Karen would have done to me. I spied on them. From my living room window, I saw Judith and Harold sitting on their porch, whispering. Every so often, Judith would glance at my house and take notes. "They're keeping a log?" Jake whispered. "Looks like it," I muttered. Then Harold pulled out a tape recorder. Jake and I stared. "Oh, they're next level crazy," Jake whispered. I sighed. This is war now. I knew they were building a case. So, I decided to screw with them. For the next 3 days, Jake and his band played at the lowest volume possible. Like, ridiculously low. Barely more than a whisper. You could have a full conversation over it. And every time they played, I saw Judith and Harold marching around their yard, frustrated, listening, taking notes, only to hear nothing worth complaining about. By the 3rd day, Judith cracked. She stormed up to my door and knocked so aggressively I thought she was going to punch through it. I opened it slowly, grinning. "Yes." She inhaled sharply. "Don't play games with me." I gasped, faking innocence. "Judith, are you accusing me of something?" She glared. "I know what you're doing." I smiled wider. "Oh, we're just following the rules. You said reasonable volume, right? Well, you can barely hear it now." She turned red. "This isn't over." She marched away. Jake came out of the garage, guitar in hand. "Did we win?" "Not yet," I muttered. "She's planning something bigger." Jake grinned. "Good. I love a challenge." The war had only just begun. Judith and Harold had gone quiet. Too quiet. After their failed noise complaint campaign, they weren't just sulking. No, they were plotting. Jake and his band had gone back to their normal rehearsals, playing at a reasonable but still rocking volume. The neighbors didn't complain, and for a while I thought maybe, just maybe, the Hendersons had finally given up. Until the HOA board meeting notice arrived. An emergency meeting. And the only topic on the agenda? Noise Ordinance Amendment Proposal, submitted by Harold and Judith Henderson. I stared at the email. You have got to be kidding me. Jake looked over my shoulder. Oh, they're really trying. They weren't just filing complaints anymore. They were trying to change the rules. Karen might have been a one-woman HOA dictatorship, but the Hendersons? They were trying to pass laws. This was bigger than just us. This was about every single Magnolia Grove resident's right to enjoy their own damn property. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Time to rally the troops. I spent the next 2 days going door to door. Did you know Judith and Harold are trying to ban music in the neighborhood? I asked at every house. The reactions were glorious. Mrs. Cooper, who had grandkids who played violin, was outraged. So what, my Abby can't practice for school orchestra anymore? The Coopers, our laid-back next-door neighbors, rolled their eyes. Man, those two need a hobby, Mr. Cooper muttered. Even the retired couple across the street, who were, let's be honest, half-deaf, got fired up. We may not hear it, but we believe in freedom, Mr. Thompson declared. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, I had an army. And the Hendersons? They had no idea what was coming. The community clubhouse was packed. More people than I'd ever seen at one of these boring HOA meetings. Judith and Harold sat at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, oozing confidence. Karen had always relied on bullying and pettiness to get her way. But the Hendersons? They were strategic. Tactical. Judith stood first. As many of you are aware, she said in that tone people use when they pretend to be reasonable, we have had an ongoing problem with excessive noise in Magnolia Grove. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Harold nodded and took over. To maintain the peaceful nature of our neighborhood, we are proposing a new noise ordinance that would prohibit excessive sounds, including amplified instruments, outside of designated hours. I stood up. And what are those designated hours? Judith smiled like a snake. Between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. on weekdays. A collective gasp. Mr. Dawson, the only sane HOA board member, blinked. Judith, that's when most people are at work or school. Exactly, she said sweetly. That way, no one will be disturbed. The room erupted. My grandson has piano lessons in the evening. Mrs. Cooper snapped. My husband listens to baseball games on the porch. Does that count? Is this some kind of joke? I let them fight it out for a few minutes before I dropped the bomb. Sergeant Davis wanted me to remind everyone that the county noise ordinance already allows reasonable music until 10 p.m. Judith stiffened. I smirked. So unless you two are planning to override county law, this whole amendment is pointless. Silence. Then, Mr. Dawson cleared his throat. All in favor of dismissing the proposal? Every hand except Judith and Harold's went up. The Hendersons had lost. Again. I thought the HOA meeting would be the end of it. I should have known better. The next morning, I walked outside to find a city inspector on my lawn. Ma'am, we received an anonymous report about improper garage renovations. I blinked. What? Then I saw Judith and Harold watching from their porch. Oh! They had reported my garage as an illegal structure. These two were officially worse than Karen. I needed a final, devastating blow. And I had one. The battle of HOA meetings was over. Now it was time for psychological warfare. That night, I gathered Jake and his band in the garage. All right, guys, I said. You're going to need to learn something new. What song? Jake asked. I grinned. Something special. The next day, at exactly 6 p.m., the band set up their speakers and began playing. Not rock. Not metal. Polka. Obnoxious. Never-ending polka. Loud. Off-key. Beautifully awful. I watched from my porch as Judith and Harold slowly lost their minds. Judith stormed out first. This is unacceptable. I sipped my wine. Oh, sorry, Judith. The noise ordinance allows reasonable music until 10 p.m. Her eye twitched. Harold came stomping over next. You can't be serious. I beamed. Asterisk, dead serious. And we'll be playing this every day until you stop harassing us. They turned red. And just like that, the war ended. They never filed another complaint. The garage stayed loud. And the Hendersons? They stayed inside. Defeated. Crushed by polka. A month later, I saw a for sale sign go up in their yard. Jake walked out, stretching. Another one down? I smiled. Another one down. He grinned. You think the next neighbors will be cool? I shrugged. If not, we always have more polka. And with that, the music played on. The Hendersons were gone. After the Great Polka Offensive, they had waved the white flag, put their house up for sale, and disappeared like villains in a bad action movie. For a glorious 3 weeks, Magnolia Grove was at peace. No HOA complaints. No passive-aggressive letters. No binocular-wielding retirees monitoring my trash can schedule. Then the sold sign went up. And the neighborhood held its breath. The moving truck arrived at midnight. Not morning. Not afternoon. Midnight. I stood at my window, watching as shadowy figures unloaded furniture. That's weird, Jake muttered behind me. Very weird, I agreed. The next morning, I got my first real look at the new neighbor. A man, tall, gangly, dressed in a bathrobe and combat boots, was standing in his yard, staring at the sky. Not checking his phone. Not stretching. Just staring. I squinted. Do you think he's... Then he pointed at the sun and screamed. Jake slowly turned to me. Oh my God. We had upgraded from HOA psychos to full-blown conspiracy theorists. His name was Paul Green, but the neighborhood immediately started calling him Prepper Paul. Because, well, Paul was a doomsday prepper. How did we find out? Because by day 3, his entire yard was covered in white heavy checkmark solar panels, white heavy checkmark barrels of water, white heavy checkmark a literal chicken coop, white heavy checkmark a bunker entrance. And the best part? He hated the HOA more than I did. By day 5, Paul had already declared war on the HOA. Judith and Harold had been calculating, but Paul did not care. First, he ignored every HOA rule. Then he started lecturing board members about government tracking devices. Then, he built a wind turbine. Right in his front yard. HOA President Mr. Dawson, who had tried to be fair before, knocked on his door, politely asking him to remove it. Paul responded by handing him a 30-page manifesto about the apocalypse. Mr. Dawson resigned the next day. At first, Paul ignored us. Until he found out the HOA had tried to shut down Jake's band. Then, something magical happened. Paul walked straight into my garage, looked at the drum set, and said, "You guys ever play outside?" Jake and his band froze. No. Paul nodded. You should. I'll help. That weekend, he built a makeshift concert stage in our backyard. Not a small one. A fully wired, amplified, ridiculous, way too big for a suburb concert stage. And then, in broad daylight, Paul set up massive speakers and yelled, "Let's melt some faces." Jake's band started playing. Loud. Louder than ever before. The entire neighborhood heard it. The HOA? They called the cops. And who showed up? Sergeant Davis. He stepped out of his cruiser, took one look at the backyard stage, then turned to me. "You know what?" he said. "Screw it. Play Free Bird." The band cheered. Paul started dancing. Judith ran inside and slammed her blinds shut. We had won. Again. The HOA finally gave up on trying to control us. Paul turned out to be the best possible neighbor. Weird, yes, but absolutely fearless when it came to keeping the HOA in check. Jake's band started getting local gigs. And me? I slept like a baby. Because for the first time in forever, I wasn't worried about HOA letters, noise complaints, or anyone ruining our fun. Well, at least until the next neighbor moves in. But hey, if that happens, we always have more polka. For 6 whole months, Magnolia Grove was quiet. Not in a Karen watching from the shadows kind of way. Not in HOA's planning their next attack kind of way. Just normal. Jake's band kept practicing. Paul kept prepping for the downfall of modern civilization. Judith and Harold stayed inside their house, fuming. The HOA stopped trying. We had one. Until the sold sign went up next door. The house on the other side of me. The one house that had never been involved in the war. A new challenger had entered the arena. The first sign of trouble came when the movers showed up. Not a normal moving company. Not U-Haul. A fleet of black SUVs. Jake peered through the blinds. Mom? Are we getting a cartel boss as a neighbor? Don't joke about that, I muttered, watching as 6 men in suits unloaded heavy crates. Then she stepped out. A woman. Late 40s. Expensive haircut. Dressed in a power suit and sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. She took one look at our house, then looked at Paul's yard full of solar panels and bunker supplies, and immediately frowned. Oh no, Jake muttered. She's a Karen. I sighed. No, Jake. She's not a Karen. Then what is she? I watched as she pulled out a clipboard. She's a final boss. Her name was Linda Fairchild. Married. 3 kids, who were all conveniently in private boarding schools. Worked in corporate law. And worst of all, she was on the HOA board before she even moved in. Paul burst into my house 2 days later, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. Did you hear? He demanded. Hear what? I asked, sipping coffee. Linda just became the HOA president. First day in the neighborhood. I choked. You're lying. Swear to God, Paul said, waving a printed email. She forced a vote via emergency proxy. Dawson's gone. She's in charge now. Jake, sitting on the couch, frowned. Wait. What happened to Mr. Dawson? Paul sighed. Retired to Florida. Couldn't take the HOA drama anymore. Jake blinked. We broke an old man. We didn't break him, I corrected. Karen, Judith, and Harold broke him. Paul shook his head. Doesn't matter. Linda's different. She's smart. She's not a Karen, she's a CEO. Jake narrowed his eyes. Then what's her first move? Paul sighed. She just rewrote every HOA rule. The new rulebook arrived that night. It was 73 pages long. 73 pages. Jake flipped through it. Mom, this is insane. It had everything. Prohibited new noise restrictions. No music over 50 decibels at any time. Prohibited no unsightly decorations. This included wind chimes, flags, and garden gnomes. Prohibited no unapproved modifications, which meant Paul's entire house was now illegal. Linda wasn't just enforcing rules. She was cleansing the neighborhood. I marched over to Paul's house, slamming the rulebook down on his bunker blueprint-covered dining table. We have a problem. Paul stared at it. Oh, this is worse than I thought. Yeah, I said. She's trying to kill our souls. Paul nodded grimly. Time for drastic measures. We held a meeting in Paul's bunker. Yes, his actual bunker. Because Paul had soundproof walls and we weren't taking any risks. The room was packed. Me, Paul, Jake and his band. Mr. Cooper, Mrs. Cooper, and half the neighborhood. Everyone had a copy of Linda's insane rulebook. This isn't just a noise complaint anymore, I told them. This is a takeover. She's turning Magnolia Grove into a damn country club. Mrs. Cooper nodded aggressively. I have 30 gnomes in my yard. 30. And she wants to take them from me. Mr. Cooper muttered. She must be stopped. Paul slammed his fist on the table. We have 2 options. We surrender, or we fight. Jake grinned. I vote fight. Paul smirked. Damn right, kid. We're going to fight. We had one goal. Get Linda removed as HOA president. To do that, we needed a majority vote from the neighborhood. So, we did the only logical thing. We threw a block party. An illegal block party. We didn't just throw a party. We threw a full-scale, community-wide concert. We set up Jake's band on Paul's roof. We grilled food. We invited everyone, even people who had no idea what was going on. And when Linda showed up, clipboard in hand, ready to shut it down, we handed her a petition for her removal, signed by 82% of the neighborhood. She turned white. This is illegal, she snapped. Paul grinned. No, Linda. You're illegal. And with that, the vote was cast. Linda? Gone. Jake's band? Played Free Bird at max volume in her honor. Magnolia Grove? Finally free. A month later, the HOA was dissolved entirely. Jake's band became local legends. Paul built a second bunker, just for fun. And me? I sat on my porch, drinking wine, listening to loud, glorious music. No noise complaints. No crazy HOA rules. No final bosses left to fight. For the first time in forever, Magnolia Grove was ours again. Jake stretched. So, Mom, what if the next neighbor is even worse? I sipped my wine. Then we'll play more polka. And with that, the music played on. For one whole year, Magnolia Grove was peaceful. Jake's band practiced freely. Paul expanded his bunker empire. The HOA was gone, and the neighborhood thrived without it. Life was perfect. Until the for sale sign went up. At Linda's old house. And then, 2 weeks later, Karen came back. It was a normal Tuesday when I saw her. Stepping out of her car. Wearing her signature beige cardigan. Carrying a clipboard. Karen. HOA Karen. Jake nearly dropped his guitar. No way, he whispered. Paul burst out of his bunker, eyes wide. Is that? Yes. But we banished her. We thought we did. Karen stood in her driveway, scanning the neighborhood with pure, unfiltered rage. She saw me. Our eyes locked. She smiled. A smile that said one thing. I'm back and I'm going to ruin your life. We should have known she wasn't done. We should have known she was planning her revenge. Because 2 days later, she reinstated the HOA. Paul stormed into my kitchen, red-faced and furious. She held a secret vote, he roared, waving a new HOA handbook. How? The HOA was dead. I gasped. Paul slammed the paper down. She found a legal loophole. Apparently, if 51% of the neighborhood signs a petition, the HOA can be reinstated. Jake skimmed the document. Who the hell would sign that? Paul sighed. Old people, mostly. Karen convinced them we needed order, again. I rubbed my temples. What are we looking at? Paul inhaled deeply. HOA rules are back. But worse. Jake frowned. How worse? Paul slid the new bylaws across the table. Police car light, no music over 30 decibels. Police car light, NO, military-style structures, AK Paul's bunkers. Police car light, no parties without HOA approval. Police car light, all garden gnomes are banned. Jake pointed at the decibel rule. 30 decibels? That's like whispering. Paul's hands trembled. She killed music. I exhaled. Then we kill the HOA. If Karen had taught me anything, it was this. You don't fight fair. So we didn't. We held another block party. But this time, we played classical music. At exactly 31 decibels. Loud enough to violate the rules. Too soft to call the cops. Karen lost her mind. She stormed into my yard, screaming. This is an outrage. I smiled. Oh, Karen, it's just a little music. What's wrong? Her eye twitched. The battle had begun. Karen had power, but so did we. For every HO fine she sent, we sent one back. Rocket she banned gnomes? We put 500 flamingos in Paul's yard. Rocket she banned parties? We invited a local jazz band for community enrichment. Rocket she tried to shut down Paul's bunker? Paul dug deeper. Rocket she threatened to fine us? We challenged every rule in small claims court. Jake's band practiced at 29 decibels. And Karen? She snapped. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. She arrived with a stack of complaints. We arrived with Sergeant Davis. Karen started screaming immediately. This neighborhood has fallen into chaos. They are ruining our standards. These people. Then Sergeant Davis stood up. Karen, he said, you have exactly 2 options. 1. Drop the complaints. 2. We file a harassment claim against you. Karen's face turned purple. For 10 whole seconds, she said nothing. Then, finally, she collapsed into her chair. Defeated. Broken. Karen was done. Karen moved out 3 weeks later. The HOA collapsed again. Jake's band played at full volume. Paul expanded his bunker. And me? I sat on my porch, drinking victory wine. Jake leaned against the door. Do you think she'll ever come back? I grinned. If she does, we'll be ready. And with that, the music played on. We thought it was over. We thought Karen was gone for good. But Karen wasn't just a normal villain. She was a horror movie villain. And just like Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, and the HOA handbook itself, she always came back. The letter arrived on a Monday. Jake picked up the mail and froze. Mom, he said, staring at a thick, legal-looking envelope. I grabbed it. My stomach dropped. From Holloway, Parker and Associates. Subject: legal action. Violation of HOA property standards. I ripped it open. And there it was. Karen had lawyered up. Paul read the letter twice before speaking. She's suing the neighborhood? Yep. But there's no HOA. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Apparently, she found a new loophole. Since Magnolia Grove was an HOA before, she claims it's still legally bound by implied deed restrictions. Paul blinked. Implied? What? Jake, flipping through the letter, snorted. Basically, she's making stuff up. Paul slammed his hand on the table. She's trying to win in court since she lost on the streets. Exactly. Jake leaned back. So, what do we do? I exhaled. We get a lawyer. The problem? Hiring a lawyer is expensive. But then Paul had an idea. Sergeant Davis has a brother. Okay. And he's a lawyer. Okay. And he used to be in a metal band. Now we're talking. Johnny Davis was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who used to be in a metal band. Leather jacket? White heavy checkmark. Long hair tied in a low ponytail? White heavy checkmark. Gold ring shaped like a skull? White heavy checkmark. The words Sue M. all tattooed on his forearm? White heavy checkmark, white heavy checkmark, white heavy checkmark. He showed up to our first meeting with a guitar case. Paul blinked. Is that for legal documents? Johnny smirked. Nah, just came from band practice. Jake immediately loved him. Mom, we hired the coolest lawyer ever. And Johnny was ready to fight. Karen's trying to pull some real BS here, he said, flipping through her lawsuit. Implied deed restrictions? That's legal fan fiction. Paul grinned. So we can beat her? Johnny cracked his knuckles. Oh, we're gonna do more than beat her. We're gonna make sure she never tries this again. The case went to trial. Not big court, just small claims court. But that didn't stop half the neighborhood from showing up. Karen arrived in a full business suit, carrying 3 massive binders. I showed up in jeans and a Def Leppard shirt. Because screw her. Johnny Davis rolled in 5 minutes late, sipping a Monster Energy drink. Karen's lawyer, a stiff-looking man in a gray suit, stood up first. Your Honor, Magnolia Grove is subject to implied deed restrictions, meaning my client's claims are legally enforceable. The judge frowned. Do you have any legal precedent for this? The lawyer flipped through his binder. Well, no, but... Johnny leaned forward. So you admit, you made it up. The lawyer turned red. That's not what I... Johnny cut him off. Your Honor, my clients bought homes in a non-HOA neighborhood. There's no contract, no legal agreement, and no basis for enforcement. This lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to bully people into submission. The judge turned to Karen. Mrs. Holloway, is there a legal contract enforcing these rules? Karen's eye twitched. Well, no, but it's about community standards. The judge sighed. Mrs. Holloway, that's not how the law works. Karen froze. She knew. She lost. Johnny wasn't done. Your Honor, he said, I'd like to file a countersuit for harassment, legal fees, and emotional damages. The judge nodded. Go ahead. Karen's jaw dropped. Wait, what? Johnny grinned. Oh yeah. You tried to scam this whole neighborhood, wasted the court's time, and harassed my clients. I'd say you owe them at least $10,000. Karen gasped like a dying fish. That's ridiculous. The judge rubbed his temples. Mrs. Holloway, considering your history, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Davis. He banged the gavel. Karen had to pay. Karen left Magnolia Grove for good. This time, there was no coming back. She sold her house in a hurry, paid the legal fines, and vanished like a bad memory. Jake's band threw a victory concert. Paul dug a victory bunker. And me? I sat on my porch, drinking the finest wine I could buy with Karen's settlement money. Jake stretched. So, Mom, what if the next neighbor is even worse? I sipped my wine. Then we get another lawyer. And with that, the music played on. For the first time in years, Magnolia Grove was finally free. No HOA. No noise complaints. No clipboard-wielding villains. Karen was gone for good. The lawsuit had drained her finances, her reputation was ruined, and the last we heard, she had moved to a high-rise condo where she could micromanage a whole new set of unsuspecting victims. And us? We lived. Jake's band got their first real gig at a local venue. Paul turned his bunker obsession into a YouTube channel. And me? I slept like a baby. No HOA letters. No Karen. No stress. Just wine, music, and peace. For real. A few months later, I was at the grocery store when a random woman stopped me. Hey, are you the lady from Magnolia Grove? I frowned. Yes. She grinned. I read about your HOA battle online. You guys are legends. I blinked. Wait, what? She pulled out her phone. There it was. A viral article titled, "How GarageBand Destroyed the Worst HOA in America." Jake, Paul, and I became local heroes. People started moving to Magnolia Grove just because there was no HOA. And Karen's nightmare reign? Just a cautionary tale. One evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset. Jake walked outside, stretching. "Kinda weird, isn't it?" he said. "What?" "No more wars. No more HOA nonsense." I smiled. "Yeah, but I think we earned it." He nodded, then picked up his guitar. "Well, think the neighborhood's ready for a concert?" I laughed. "Always." And as the first chord rang out across Magnolia Grove, I knew. This was the ending we fought for. The HOA was dead. The music was alive. And for the first time in forever, we could play as loud as we wanted.